Alright, today we are going to be taking a look at and reviewing the Pimax Crystal here. A headset which promises a lot, from eye-tracked foveated rendering, extremely high fidelity 35 ppd, and a decent but not wide FOV that the company's known for. Some of those promises live up to the hype, and some very much do not. We're going to take an in-depth look at the Crystal and its feature set as it is today, as I've got a lot to say and look at, from how the Crystal has changed between the pre-release beta and now, to even the manufacturing specs of the panel being used in it. Some rather interesting finds there, honestly. But we also have to talk about the behavior of the company behind it, as they are asking for a lot of trust concerning the future features. So, buckle up, because this review is probably going to be a very long one. Quick disclaimer, I was not sent this for free. I was part of the closed beta test, but I still did have to pay for my own unit. I had some coupons which brought down the price a fair bit, like the existing Pimax discount, but it was still not a cheap purchase. I'm going to go point by point, covering my thoughts on everything from the visuals, the performance, the comfort, things like that, starting with the positive aspects first, and then we get into the negatives. So, with that out of the way, let's get started by looking at the major selling point on the Crystal, and why most would buy it: the visual experience and the clarity. To begin with, there are the lenses. The Crystal uses glass spheric lenses that advertise 35 ppd, and it is 2880 by 2880 per eye screens. And they claim 125 horizontal field of view, and we've got a lot to talk about, but that's for later on the FOV. While also promising remarkable clarity on top of all that. And I think it delivers on the clarity. For context, the highest pixel density HMD I have used, for an extended time at least, prior to this, were the Reverb G2 and Vive Pro 2. And this, I don't know how else to say this, this feels like a generational leap in clarity over those. The screen door effect is basically non-existent, and the general sharpness of everything is honestly beginning to approach monitor territory. I have a 43-inch 4K monitor, and while, yes, it is sharper than the Crystal, for the first time, a VR headset doesn't feel so far behind the monitor that making comparisons is just unfair. I feel comfortable pointing at videos, the 4K videos I record, and confidently saying, yeah, it looks pretty close to that inside the headset. It is truly that good. If you saw my first impressions video, I could pretty reliably read down to the second to last line on the text clarity test in Test HMD from 5 meters away. And I could largely read the very last line from about 4 meters. I've never even gotten close to that on anything else. The fidelity is actually so high that for the first time, I'm starting to feel like the games themselves are becoming what's limiting me instead of my headset's resolution. At least sometimes. And here's the other thing. On top of the immense clarity over the other HMDs I'm used, the lens design means that you have that across the entire lens. Well, almost all of it. It is not quite perfect 100% edge to edge, and I unfortunately have not tried the Quest Pro to compare it to, as people say that is perfect, but it's so sharp and clear. I can read small text in the Steam VR desktop viewer all the way near the edge of my peripheral. Here, you know what? I'm even going to prove a point right now. I've moved my script directly in front of me, and this is using 12-point Liberation Serif font without any zooming on the Steam VR desktop mirror. Now, let's see. Watch how far I can turn my head. Read that small text. I'll even put what I have on screen, or what I'm reading right now on screen, 1 second. And the edge-to-edge clarity is actually something that takes a little getting used to, since I actually don't need to turn my head that much when doing stuff like these videos. I can just move my eyes, for the most part at least. And now it's back in the center of my view, and look how far I could turn my head. Another notable benefit for this style of lens is that the glare is basically non-existent. If you're coming from Fresnel-based solutions, like say every previous gen HMD, then it is definitely quite noticeable how nice the lack of glare on these lenses are. Which makes the contrast ratio feel even better too, since you don't gotta worry about glare potentially ruining the scenes. I have to mention another thing in the Crystal's features, that being the interchangeable lenses. I know some people have ragged on this, but I will be honest, I disagree with the complaints, and conceptually I love this feature. Because even if Pimax or third parties don't capitalize on the feature to make new style lenses, though Pimax is already working on some others, but again, that's for some company issues to discuss later, it makes this easily repairable and one less point of failure that'll brick your headset if damage does happen to it. I have seen so many people who've had damaged lenses on their HMD or gotten some dust stuck behind them, and that's pretty much a death sentence for your headset. You have to get a new one, unless you are very good at disassembly, and few people are. But here, if you damage the lenses or get something stuck behind them, you can simply remove them and replace them with a new one, or just wipe down the second protective layer. No need to send the entire headset or buy another in for warranty, or just buy another one. And I'm kind of surprised so few people seem to have brought this up, because I think that alone is a pretty neat design, even without Pimax working on extra lenses. And yes, sure, maybe some dust can get stuck in it when you do open up the lenses, but it's so easy to clean. I changed out the lenses over 10 times easily when doing some testing, and it's so easy to use a microfiber cloth to just wipe down the internal second layer to get rid of the dust. Never impacted my clarity or experience. It doesn't even interfere with the eye tracking either, though one criticism I will say, and this can be both a pro and a con depending on how you look at it, is the lenses feel very, very hard to remove. They are really secure, which is good, since you don't want them falling out while you're moving your head around. But if you are figuring to constantly swap them out, you might be in for a little bit of frustration, and I wouldn't recommend swapping it a bunch. It is not all perfect, though. While the Crystal's lenses are my personal favorite that I've used so far, there are a couple issues I need to mention. Notably, the actual sweet spot is very sensitive to being in the right spot, but not quite in the same way other headsets are, because the edge-to-edge clarity, which is different, is so good. That is, what I'm talking about is there is a very precise place your eyes need to be, or else you'll start seeing artifacts like geometric distortions and increased chromatic aberration. When the eye tracking is fully functioning and working for consumers with the auto IPD and everything, that'll most likely make this much less a concern, since in theory it should just be completely trivial to find the sweet spot. Once you're in it though, yep, near perfect edge-to-edge clarity and geometric distortions are not an issue. You don't have to worry about the thing moving around and like causing a bunch of stuff on the sides. But chromatic aberration, that is the big weak point when it comes to the Crystal's optics on visuals. It's kind of a complex issue too. See, in the center of the lens, it's actually really good, and I would say not too much of a problem to speak of. Emphasis generally. Because even in the center, there are certain elements where it does get really bad. The most notable one I found was opening up the SteamVR overlay. I will show a picture from through the lens to illustrate the point. And it's just really bad there. But the other thing is that it starts to become more noticeable at the peripheral of your vision. How bad this is going to vary from scene to scene. Sometimes it's hard to notice at all, and other times it's definitely not too great. Personally, I would classify it as a pretty minor thing for me, and not something I notice often if I'm not looking for it. Outside of the worst case scenarios like a SteamVR, of course, SteamVR UI. But some people are definitely going to be bothered by it, and there's also some blue shift which happens at the edges, because that's another issue I noticed more, and somewhat in the center too. It makes for kind of a weird, almost double image sort of thing on solid blue objects. These, however, should be correctable in software, so hopefully it can be improved. But that's where things are at this time of this writing, and who knows how long it could take. But the lenses that are just one part of the optical stack. Let's talk about another major component, the screen itself. And I got something good for this. Through some digging from a disassembly of the crystal that Pimax did a while back, this panel was discovered. I will show the specs on screen, sourced from Panel Look, which is a public database anyone can access. Nothing confidential here. And as you can see, some specs are looking kind of familiar to what Pimax is advertising now, don't they? Now, I know some people have definitely been skeptical of Pimax's marketing claims before, but at least what they're advertising here, you can see this, most of it checks out. So let's dive into what does and what does not. So firstly, we have things like the 20,000:1 contrast ratio, the 100% NTSC color gamut, the brightness, the refresh rate, all there. I would like to point out, though, that if you look at the 90 Hz and mouse over it, it says 120 Hz and 120 Hz backlight. So despite what's I know was a controversy for a while back, 120 Hz is fine, and many people have gotten it working. You can see it in FPS VR in my videos, too. Some configurations, namely with first shipment fiber optic cables, did have issues, though, yes. And it is speculation, but the theory I've seen as to why it feels like the best explanation is that it's possible the crystal's packaging bent the fiber cables too much, since fiber does not like being bent at extreme angles for long periods of time and can potentially get damaged with doing that. Nothing has been confirmed though yet, so again, don't take this as fact. If you do have the bug of being stuck at 90 Hz, though, you should contact Pimax support for another cable, because this should work. I've had it work on the fiber, and I've had it work on the copper cable. But, again, a little bit more on all that later. We're gonna talk about those launch issues concerning all that, and the company practices. Oh, do I have a lot to say there. But we're gonna come back to that much later, because a lot to talk about needs its own section. For now, you may notice a few slight inconsistencies, though, like the brightness. But you can overclock the panels like you can, well, pretty much anything else. And Pimax is overclocked like every single panel I've seen in their headsets, quite drastically sometimes. But the point is, it is close enough that with the manufacturer specs here in mind and my own experience, I at least mostly believe the advertised specs that Pimax is putting out. Or at least that they are reasonably close, unlike the field of view. But you gotta factor in things like the loss of light from the lenses, and the image gets brighter with local dimming off, and not sure if the panel specs here are considering duty cycle or not. So that 200 nits is certainly not delivered to the eye brightness, but for the sake of this review, I'm going to generally trust the specs here are at least ballpark accurate, or a best case scenario at worst, as manufacturer specs sometimes tend to be. As I do not have the capacity to spend several $100s on equipment to personally verify all this stuff, I haven't seen anyone else do it, so yeah. It definitely feels very bright, though. Easily one of the brightest HMDs I've used, and I've owned almost 10 different ones. But really, this panel is good. Perhaps one of the best we've gotten in consumer VR. The color gamut is among the widest we've gotten too. For some extra context, I found this great Reddit post from a few years back by Eagle Shadow, link will be in the description, which used some professional tools to measure the color gamut of the Index and the HTC Vive, the original one. The Index only had 88% of DCI-P3 and 66% of Rec 2020, while the OG Vive, and people love the colors of OLED panels like that one had, has about 97% DCI-P3 and about 76% of Rec 2020. So the Crystal is actually trading blows with OLED, since 100% NTSC corresponds to 104% DCI-P3 and just under 75% of Rec 2020. For some more context, having full or close to DCI-P3 is generally a good baseline for doing color-sensitive work, and Rec 2020 standard is the toughest color standard I know of. And it covers around 75% of the visual light spectrum. So yeah, if you value good colors from OLED, you will definitely not be disappointed with respect to the Crystal here. Speaking of OLED though, let's talk about the local dimming and the blacks, because contrast ratio is another major point for those who favor OLED, and the Crystal's local dimming is something that Pimax has made a noticeable fuss about. So, the Crystal has 576 zones per eye, or 1,152 total. Context, the Quest Pro has 500, but I could not find if that was per eye or total. I'm assuming the former and the two are close in zones, though. Now, the local dimming itself, I think this is largely pretty great. but it is not perfect. Where it seems to do quite well are scenes with some very deep blacks, but numerous lights scattered around. Something like, say, Space Engine with the many stars in the sky, something like during the nighttime of Skyrim, or if you're in a pitch black area, but with one very bright source of light, such as, say, Phasmophobia in a house with no lights. In those situations, the blooming is very minor to borderline insignificant, and it truly feels like a significant benefit to have. However, there are still situations where the limitations become quite apparent versus OLED. In situations where it is incredibly dark, but there are only a few light sources or spots which have fine details, then the blooming starts to become more noticeable when using the highest settings, especially if those light sources are dim, but just bright enough to be seen. Some examples of these worst case situations are something like the opening area of the first stage in Phasmophobia, with the porch walkway and several lights around in a pure black night. Or something like 1943 Berlin Blitz, where you are riding in the plane and the lights go off. There's some pretty bad blooming around the pilots and the sides. Unfortunately, I can't show this properly in the recording as it doesn't show up there. There's a panel limitation, and through the lens just does not properly illustrate it or do it justice at the resolutions and stuff we're talking about here. There were only a few times I found the blooming so bad I wanted to adjust the settings though. So as a whole, I was quite impressed, and at best it definitely does feel OLED-like. At its worst though, while the contrast is excellent, the blooming can be quite distracting and take away from the immersion due to the inconsistent image of the white haze over certain dark areas. Thankfully, you do have some options here. You can adjust the settings to remove the bloom, but also maintain reasonably alright blacks. But it does take some manual editing. See, in the Pimax software, you can change your local dimming settings between extreme, highlight, balanced, and off. But even highlight brings the contrast ratio down significantly, to where it is a little bit closer to what you'd expect from LCD with VR. It may be on the good end for it. However, as I said, it's possible to manually edit the local dimming values by going to profile.json, locate under the file path I will show on screen, make sure you have enable viewing hidden folders checked in Windows, and then you adjust the local dimming values there. The values of each setting correspond to the number that's on screen. But thanks to some experimenting by Dextro from the Pimax Discord, they found the value to 0.01, removed the blooming pretty much entirely. But it still provides a contrast ratio, which is quite good. Definitely a big step up from other LCD headsets, though it still falls a little bit short of compared to OLED. It's sort of halfway in between them. You can lower this value even further though. The lowest value I tested was 0.001. But at that point, the blooming started to come back, and the improvement was somewhat marginal. Ultimately, I decided to go with 0.005, seemed to be the best while doing this. The blacks were still better than any other LCD headset I've used, but Extreme was still a noticeable improvement if you absolutely need those deepest blacks. Some games, I would still use Extreme even despite the blooming because it wasn't a problem. But some I would definitely rather use this tweak. Overall, I like the local dimming, especially coupled with the colors. I think that people who are big on OLED and VR versus LCD might find the Crystal's displays quite compelling. But if you need those OLED blacks, the Crystal will still fall sometime short depending on the scene. But this is where we're gonna get into a little bit of marketing smoke and mirrors. So let's briefly talk about the HDR claim on their page. I did a lot of research about various HDR standards and wanted to talk about that with respect to VR because monitor HDR certifications on things like NITs are not quite the same as a VR environment. But then Pimax confirmed the Crystal was 8-bit as to looking up the panel, so none of that matters! Because to make a long story short, HDR requires at least 10-bit color depth to properly display the increased dynamic range, and if something only supports 8-bit signal output, it's not really ever going to be true HDR. You can still technically use HDR on a 8-bit display, but pretty much every notable HDR standard I'm aware of, from HDR10, Dolby Vision, HDR10+, and HLG10, all require 10-bit support or higher. And also, yes, you can send a 10-bit signal to something that only supports 8-bit. Virtual Desktop enabled that recently, and you will still see benefits from it, but is not the same as being able to natively support 10-bit and display it. Or you can also use what a bunch of monitors use, and that's FRC or frame rate control with dithering to get 10-bit with an 8-bit display. I bet most people would not be able to tell the difference between a true native 10-bit and just 8-bit with FRC. But that doesn't sound like what Pimax is doing though, and I'm not sure if FRC even works in VR. But anyway, Pimax claims they have an HDR algorithm that, to quote one of the engineers, is implemented through local dimming algorithms and gives a wider gamut and improved contrast. Which is a vague answer, and I can't really test the specifics of how it supposedly improves those things. I've seen what things like Windows Auto HDR can do, and it can sometimes be rather impressive for what it is on my HDR 1000 display. The colors on the Crystal, though, still look really, really good either way, and probably the best I've seen. I don't care how they do it as long as it works. But the HDR algorithm thing does feel like a bit of a marketing buzzword. Claiming HDR on the page is also, it just doesn't seem accurate to me when it's only 8-bit is supported, unless they're using FRC, and if Pimax wants to correct me on the Crystal and that can support native HDR, then by all means go ahead. The HDR claim is not as bad as their FOV claims though, which... that is just... oh, I have been waiting half a year for what I am about to do here. But before I get to ranting, I want to make two things clear. Firstly, in a vacuum, the FOV of the Crystal is actually not that bad versus headsets that aren't Pimax's own. It's pretty average horizontally, maybe even a tiny bit above average, but it's definitely above average vertically. If you don't look at what's promised in the marketing, you probably won't be that disappointed if you're not coming from Pimax's other headsets. And secondly, some of the criticism which I am about to level at Pimax is a bit of an industry problem, since there is a real issue with companies being generous when it comes to their field of view, and like for example the HTC Vive Pro 2, that advertised 120 degrees horizontal, but go check basically any reviewer using a reliable measuring tool and the max they get is 116, often needing a gasket mod too, and the rendered field of view, which we're going to talk about that in a bit, it's also 116. Vario also shipped the Aero claiming 115, and the rendered FOV of that barely reaches 100. And I have not seen anyone get close to 115 subjectively either. So Pimax is not the only one guilty of exaggerating FOV. What they are guilty of is the sheer degree of exaggeration on their field of view, to where I would say it's more outright lying instead of just an exaggeration. See, Pimax has claimed 125 degrees horizontal and 140 diagonal since day one. It is right here in their announcement video. It's on their website's official spec sheet, and it is in basically all their marketing. They've gotten extremely defensive over it too, but the real FOV numbers are nowhere near that. I've talked to several other people. I've had them all measure with the same tool, Test HMD 1.2, and not one of them got over 105 horizontal. I've checked several other YouTube channels who reviewed the Crystal and measured their horizontal FOV using various tools too. I'm going to flash through each one that I could find on screen right now. Again, none of them got close to the claim spec. And I used four different ways to measure the FOV. I'm going to briefly show all those on screen. And you know what all of these have in common? They're all quite close to each other. Sure, there is some variance, but there is a reasonably close consistency in all the measurements from all the tools across everyone I've seen. Test HMD and WimFOV are taking my subjective measurements from what I can see. So those are going to be prone to eye and face shape variance, yes, but you can't just say, oh, maybe you can't see more FOV. No! I say nay, because Pimax XR is just reading what the Pimax client is telling it the FOV is. And then the HMDQ tool also grabs what the headset reports to applications to render. It grabs the rendered FOV. These two are not subjective numbers. Nobody, and I mean literally nobody is getting remotely close to what Pimax is claiming. Nearly every independent measurement I have seen all lines up reasonably well with multiple different tools on the horizontal. The FOV claimed by Pimax, it's not just an exaggeration, it feels like a lie. And I think Pimax knows they backed themselves into a corner and had to double down on it or just quietly avoid mentioning it, because Pimax's marketing has claimed 125 horizontal and 140 diagonal from day one, like I said, long before the wide FOV lenses were a thing. If anyone's gonna say, oh, maybe the wide FOV lenses were the original ones and they just switched those out. No.
Editors know. I was going to mention how the FOV numbers had changed in some of the advertising, but I found a better example after I recorded this, because on this other blog post dated February 20th, it lists 2 lens specs, only 2, just the 35 ppd and the 42 originally, not the wide FOV, and it says module 1 reaches 140 degrees diagonally at 35 ppd. Then it says module 2 reaches 120 diagonal at 42. And so, yeah, the FOV, they've changed what they're saying it is.
In a blog post dated April 19th, that was a poor attempt to address the FOV complaints, where they claim the standard 35 ppd lens changed to 130 degrees diagonal, but the wide FOV lenses were now 140 diagonal. Yet, once again, on the specs page that is out right now, at the time of this writing and recording, which is July 29th, they're claiming 140 diagonal on the current lens. And yet they still refuse to mention exact numbers when they are normally extremely proud and boastful about numbers. Instead, now they're just saying the wide FOV is going to be about 15% larger than the current ones. And I'd normally say it's fine if they're not mentioning exact FOV numbers, but they're advertising very specific numbers and set the expectations of consumers to have those numbers, and have been doing this for almost a year. Pimax even fought me over my small rant from my first impressions video a while back, if you remember that, and I had to fight a bit to get that published. They did not want me to discuss the recent numbers, and I had to edit them out to keep the rest of the rant. But I have no NDA here now. Given all this behavior, it's really not a good look for Pimax, and I think they know what the situation is and don't want to admit it. But anyway, to calm down for a minute, let's talk about the rendered FOV, because I'd like to just briefly touch on that and why I place the value in RISA 2000's tool that I do. I was planning on going a lot more in depth with this originally, but I'm going to have to make the subject brief, because this script is well over 12k words, and I really don't want to turn half my review solely into ranting about FOV, when it's already likely going to be like 45 minutes long at this point. So if you'd like to see things in a bit more depth, I will be including a link to an excellent article by RISA 2000 concerning the importance of rendered FOV, and this number in the description. They'll explain it better than I have, and also explain all the math behind how they get their numbers. So, that said, what is rendered FOV, and how does it relate to the crystal's claims? Well, very simply put, it is how much field of view is physically rendered by the device. As one example, something like the 8KX has such a monstrously huge field of view because it has the larger screens and can physically render more field of view than something like the crystal can without running into issues. More on that in a moment. You cannot have more FOV than is physically rendered because more simply doesn't exist. Now, in some apps which measure FOV, the way they measure it can lead to slight variance in bigger numbers, or smaller sometimes. I'll put this great post by Risa on screen now if you'd like to read it in more detail, and I'll just paraphrase it. But the reason is that due to how they render the markers and place them in front of the eyes or the head pose, it can result in plus or minus a few degrees. But it shouldn't vary wildly like the over 20 Pimax is claiming versus what we get. Having the rendered image line up properly with your eyes and the viewing frustrum helps ensure everything lines up correctly, and what you see in the virtual world is reflected in the real world. Like if I move my hand right in front of me here with the controller, its position in the virtual world lines up with the real world. If it didn't, you can imagine how interacting with anything would be quite the problem, since your perspective doesn't line up. My hand could be here in reality, but in the virtual world maybe appears like slightly over here. And you may ask yourself, why doesn't stuff feel off if you don't get the full rendered FOV then? After all, if you check some of the numbers using the HMDQ tool, lots of people get less. At the end of the day, you're viewing a screen through a lens designed designed to focus the image in a manner which feels real. You can't just remove the lens and look at the screen directly. If your eyes are, for example, slightly sunken in and you don't see the full screen, you're still fine. You could because you can think of this as like looking at a window to the virtual world, and that window just gets smaller the further away you are. Or you could kind of think of it like how you view a monitor from a slightly different distance that covers more or less your FOV. It still looks right, it just feels less of your vision. But then, why can't the same apply for getting your face closer to the lenses and give you more FOV? I've seen people make that argument before that covers more of their real FOV as they get their eyes closer. Well, because number one, you're limited by the lenses. No matter how close you try and get your face, the lenses are an impassable barrier that you can never overcome. And secondly, because the screen physically doesn't have more FOV to display. Even if you were to, hypothetically for argument's sake, get past that barrier while maintaining the VR effect, think of it like how if you were to glue your eyes to a big TV. I mean, like, press so close they were basically touching the screen. It would cover more of your FOV, but that's not going to do you any good since I shouldn't have to explain how badly the image is going to appear versus watching it on the couch. But again, you can't even do that here because the lenses are limiting how close you get. Unless you were to try and force more when it's not designed for it, right? Well, you don't want to do that. So I'm going to show some images on screen right now. Please view this in full screen to best illustrate it. People often talk about ultra-wide monitors for more FOV increases in flat screen, so we're going to use that as a comparison. The top image here is a native 13:9 image and was made with that aspect ratio in mind, while the bottom is a standard 16:9 image. They both look correct and nothing warped or distorted. Right? Well, look what happens if we try to stretch that 16:9 image to be the same as the one with it is designed in mind. Things start to look a little warped and stretched compared to the image which naturally was made with a 13:9 aspect ratio. And though they both cover the same space on the screen, the one which was made with that wide FOV aspect ratio and FOV in mind just physically has more to look at there and it isn't distorted. For a quick comparison, here's the native 16:9 image beside the same image stretched to fill 31:9, and you're not actually seeing more compared to the image made with 31:9 because more doesn't exist there. And this is why VR companies don't do this and are going by, and I advocate going by rendered FOV as a theoretical maximum. Though it's good when combined with some subjective measurements because how well the headset will deliver that FOV to you is kind of vary. If all's well, you should get equal to or less than the rendered. But also know, this is not the only reason you'll see distortion. So, please, nobody take this out of context and claim this is happening if they see distortions or something. There could be other reasons. And if you still doubt me, don't take my word for it. Take Pimax CEO Kevin Henderson voicing support for this tool a while back right here. Yeah. So, TLDR, the Crystal's 125-degree FOV is just made up. It's made up. But Pimax is releasing some wider FOV lenses that, if they actually do get the 15% degrees horizontal they claim, that would bring the FOV up to slightly below 120, which would be good and close to the original numbers. But given everything that's already happened with the FOV, I'm going to reserve judgment until I see it. Alright, so with that massive rant out of the way, let's get back to some other aspects of the Crystal, namely the controllers and their tracking quality. To start with the controllers themselves, these things are ergonomically my favorite controllers I've ever used stock. They're basically Quest 2 clones, yes, but they are just slightly bigger and longer so that they may fit bigger hands like mine. And it's more comfortable to hold than the Quest 2 ones, at least, again, for my bigger hands. If you're thinking, oh, I'll just use my Quest 2 accessories with this thing. Well, compatibility is a bit hit or miss here due to slightly bigger dimensions. The tracking ring is just slightly off, so stuff like the gunstock mounts here, they mostly fit, but you do need to do a little bit of DIY, and I also have the knuckle grips here, but you might see here I had to do a lot of cutting with scissors to make them fit. So, but if you are hoping to reuse Quest 2 accessories, it might work, but expect to do some DIY, and even then it's not a sure shot. They're also the lightest controllers you'll ever use. Each weighs about 130 grams, which makes them slightly, but just noticeably, lighter than Quest 2 controllers with a battery in them. I guess this is because they have an integrated rechargeable battery via the bottom USB-C port. The battery life on these is also absurdly long. I've went almost 3 weeks of semi-regular use on my left controller here before it was in the single-digit percentage. They are also capable of doing full, and not just capacitive sensor for your thumb and index finger tracking. Or, well, they say they are, but the feature is not working at the moment, at least from the beta testers, and so no ETA on it at this time. But I still bring it up because before you get excited, these do finger tracking via the Steam VR skeletal input system, not the same way the Knuckles do it. Which means if the game doesn't support that, no full finger tracking yet. Although, they just recently added an option to emulate the Knuckles in the Pimax software, so I don't know if maybe they're going to change that at some point. We'll see, and I'll come back and revisit that if they do. But if they don't, I don't know the list which does support the Steam VR skeletal input system, and I can't test it because I don't have it enabled yet. But at the very least, I know that Half-Life Alyx supports it, whereas VR Chat does not at this time. So that's kind of disappointing, as social VR feels like the one big place where finger tracking would be a big deal. Now, as for the controller tracking, well, as I was writing this review, Pimax sent out a big update, which had massive improvements. Before, I would have said that the tracking is usable in most stuff. It held up well doing stuff in motion, like say Blade and Sorcery or things like this, or interacting with the environments in Alyx quite well. But when not moving and needing to do some slow menu navigation or careful adjustments on aiming like this, it was definitely a bit hit or miss. But now, honestly, I'm ditching my Lighthouse gear now because I do not like the index knuckles for several reasons. But before anyone takes the wrong message from that, I am not saying these are as good as Lighthouses. Not at all. They are not. I'd say they're actually still a little bit below the Quest 2. However, they are at least good enough that, for my use case, which includes stuff like Pavlov, adventure games such as Skyrim, and Melee and Blade and Sorcery, I largely don't feel like I have to fight the tracking. And it feels great. There are still a few points to improve on, though. It's not quite perfect, and I could see how some issues may arise in certain situations. The controllers seem to have trouble if you, like, rotate them a bit on the side, kind of at this angle or so. Sometimes, not always, but if you don't hold it, it's usually fine. The only problem that it's really caused for me is if you see this mount right here, if you hold it sideways, well, with the gunstock mount, if I hold it like this, then I get some drifting and issues on it. But if I just hold it straight on like you would, you know, when not using a gun stock, perfectly fine. No issues. And of course, obviously none of this applies if you are going to go with the Lighthouse faceplate and use that ecosystem, but who knows when that'll come out. Now with the controllers out of the way, let's move back onto the headset and talk about comfort here. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room. The weight. Since we're not in 2021 where every HMD is big and bulky by default, the Crystal's big size and weight is it a legitimate con that needs to be talked about in 2023. But at the same time, just looking at the raw weight doesn't exactly tell the full story. Face size does seem to play a part of this, so I want to preface is from my experience talking to a few others and then having some people try on my HMD, I think the design of the Crystal generally favors larger head, while people with a bit smaller ones may have it a little bit harder time. Since stock, the Crystal actually fits my face fairly well. The strap is actually almost too small for my head, and I wish it was just a little bit longer. But stock, I think the Crystal's comfort and balance is quite good. It might start feeling a little, emphasis little, front heavy after a bit more than like 2 hours of play, and then there's some wobbling from rapid movements. There are some room for improvement still, but rated next to the other HMDs I've tried, and I've used almost every major head strap design from the pre-Pancake lens era, I'd rate the Crystal near the top, honestly. The thing weighs as much as the 8KX does, about 1.2 kilograms, and let me tell you, it is far more comfortable than that is. It does not feel like it is 1.2 kg if you have tried that. Even when adding counterweights on the 8KX, it still feels better. Because up to a point, the raw weight matters less than how it is distributed. And the Crystal distributes it very well. Even stock, playing for around 2 hours, it still felt reasonably comfortable. Oh, not perfect. And I have used stuff like the Pico 4 for a shorter session too. So I don't only have big headsets as the frame of reference. For how big and heavy it is, Pimax has done a truly fantastic job at the weight distribution and the comfort, especially compared to their first go-around with the 8KX back there. And there's still room to improve, yeah, especially if you do play longer sessions. And if you do want to improve it, there are a couple options that aren't too pricey. I made a little video covering some bug fixes and accessories on the Crystal. You can go check that out if you'd like to see things in more detail. But the one addition from there is I do have this 100 grams of counterweight on the back, but that's because with the default cable routing on this thing right here, my pulley system adds a little bit of a tug that just so slightly throws off the balance. And I route it this way because it keeps the cable out of my way, but you may not feel the need to do that. So if you don't, I consider the counterweight very, very optional. And on wireless, I don't think it's going to be a thing. I feel like I could wear this thing almost forever with these mods. Affiliate links will be in the description if you do want them, but if you're already satisfied, I wouldn't consider them that needed. It was an improvement, but not, "This changes the experience forever," or some similarly stupid headline. At least for me. Some people, especially those who had some issues with the Crystal, seemed like a lot more positive on the add-ons and found them a huge improvement. When it comes to other factors though, such as the heat for comfort, I found the Crystal was pretty good at that one. One of the better headsets for thermals for me, likely thanks to the 2 active cooling fans right here. Unfortunately, though, despite having the active cooling, it does not have the active airflow in the iBox that the Vario Aero has, and that I see some people totally rave about. As for the audio, well, this one's a little complicated, and we gotta address this in 2 parts. Firstly, the quick one that's easy, and that's the microphone. As you can tell from my usage in this review, and it's pretty good. It's super high quality, easily one of the best microphones out there for VR, and I put it up there with the Index. Pimax was experimenting a bit with the audio quality, so if you go back to some of my earlier videos, you will likely see some inconsistent mic quality. But at the time of this writing, it's good. I like it, and I hope Pimax doesn't change it. But for the second half, the headphones here, things are going to get a little bit tricky on that. So, a lot of people have complained about latency, but the problem doesn't seem to be universal. Back in the beta test, there was a time where several testers complained about hideous audio latency, upwards of a few hundred milliseconds. But then several other testers, myself included, just didn't have that latency. And no, it was not just, "Oh, you're not sensitive." I did several tests, and I was not getting the same absurd latency in any of them. But when I used Bluetooth headphones, which are often infamous for latency, the experience was exactly what I saw people complaining about. It seems to be very inconsistent, the audio latency issue. And I have no clue why. I did some testing and talked to other people about various things. Discord user Elbios did some number crunching on the latency on the Android side, and then also helped me do some DPC latency testing, but the numbers didn't add up. Again, I'm at a loss. I simply don't have the latency problem though, so I get to enjoy my audio. Pimax did just recently add a low latency sound mode though for people facing this, and this is only in the beta test client. Well, I want to preface by saying this is a work in progress and only to the beta testers for a reason at this time. It might, and hopefully probably will, based on what I've seen, how things have improved, be better for the wider consumer release. But at this time, I'll be blunt, I am never going to use that mode, and thank God I'm not getting a significant latency. Because now we're going to talk about audio quality, and I can summarize the quality on one word in the low latency mode. Terrible! It's bad. I can hear the audio compression happening on certain sounds, particularly those that are bass heavy. It needs a lot of work. So I'm going to focus on the standard mode. I don't know if this may have to do with the latency. Again, back in the beta, it was better than the Index quality and everyone agreed with it. But now I'm hearing complaints about the audio quality and it just being kind of okay. And on that, I don't agree. It's not as good as it used to be at the peak, but I did notice a little bit of a drop here, but I'd still say it feels like one of the best VR audio solutions we have right now. It easily up there, close, comparable to the Index. I thought, oh, maybe I was just crazy or not sensitive. I'm not a super crazy audio guy. But I have had 2 people, both of whom have used the Index, try out my unit specifically, and they were very impressed. One even said, and they've also used studio headphones before too, it definitely felt comparable to the Index in some upper end audio stuff, like the few hundred range, not like the few thousand range. I don't know. The Pimax experience on things seems to vary a lot from person to person, and that's just my experience. The quality on this, by the way, applies solely to the DMAS headphones. The stock audio, the CMAS V2, which you've probably seen on the renders, well, it's okay on standard mode. I don't even want to try it on low latency, Kind of middle of the road for audio, not awful, not terrible. For 1600 USD, it's a little bit of a letdown though. But Pimax isn't the only one to skimp out on audio a bit at the high end when it comes to stock, so at least you do have the option to upgrade to something nice without needing to buy your own headphones. Also want to mention in standard mode, there is a bit of a weird quirk on the headset where the Windows volume and headset volume is controlled separately. What I mean there is that the volume up and volume down buttons here, they lower the volume on the headset, but not in Windows. The headset effectively has 2 volume sliders, and I have no idea why. I ended up using around 100% Windows and 50% HMD since this is deafeningly loud. At 100%, your neighbors will hear this thing. And for performance, well, I already made 2 in-depth videos covering performance on the 4090 with it, 3 if you count the CPU comparison, so I will be brief here. Except concerning eye tracking and DFR, since you can check the other videos if you want for more detail, but I haven't talked about those too much. Before that, though, the Crystal's 100% res, which is about 4.3K by 5.1K. It's really high, and loads of people were intimidated at first, but it's actually not so bad. The raw pixel density on the Crystal means that you can use lower levels of anti-aliasing and still get a sharp image without much shimmer. This in turn leads to far better performance if the game uses MSAA, sometimes even literally almost double FPS using ×2 versus ×4. I can actually play quite a lot of my games at 120Hz mode on the 4090. Though there are still, of course, a few which absolutely just make it beg for mercy, like the RE8 VR mod. But there is something on the Crystal which is a pretty unique advantage to Pimax's software stack, actually. At least in open VR games. See, the Crystal has eye tracking, and with that comes the ability to use dynamic foveated rendering, which will lower the graphics in your peripheral while maintaining full detail you are looking. So, in theory, it should be mostly seamless and unnoticeable. Now, the eye tracking isn't public at the time of this review, but hopefully it's going to be available in the not-too-distant future. So, I'm still going to talk about it. Pimax specifically does DFR via variable rate shading, which is just one of the few ways to do DFR. You can also use fixed foveated rendering in OpenVR games via the VR Perf kit using this same method, and also dynamic foveated rendering in select OpenXR games with any eye-tracked HMD via things like the OpenXR toolkit. But in OpenVR games, to my knowledge, there aren't any other programs which can use DFR in OpenVR games like this. So this is a legitimate edge and selling point for Pimax to have, because sometimes the gains can actually be quite substantial. When I was using Skyrim, I saw an average boost of around 20%, sometimes even higher in select areas. And that's significant. That is really significant because that's on the 4090. You cannot get a more powerful GPU. The only options at that point are just turn down the settings or turn down the resolution. From some preliminary testing, this method of DFR seems like it benefits lower-end GPUs a little more noticeably than higher-end. I saw around 40-45% gains on my 3080 Ti laptop in a scene where my 4090 only got around 10-ish or so, 10%, but I'm going to have to take a deeper look into that and plan to do so in another dedicated video. The performance doesn't appear to be exactly free, though. See, the eye tracking is good enough that noticing visual artifacts, even on the most aggressive setting, is quite difficult in most cases. In certain contexts, though, you can still see them, but I'd say it's quite rare. I'd say 9 out of 10 times it's either not that noticeable or easily worth the uplift. The other thing, however, is that in some games, using DFR causes a noticeable increase on CPU load. You can see details in my Skyrim benchmark from recent videos I did. But the CPU frame times went up by like 50% using DFR, and I even became CPU bound in one spot on my old CPU. This isn't the case with every game, and in fact, most games I've briefly tested, they saw a pretty negligible increase. But if you have a weak CPU, then in some games there is a chance DFR could be detrimental. In general, though, I think this is a huge edge for Pimax, as long as you have an NVIDIA card, that is. Because it is variable rate shading based, AMD lacks support outside of DirectX 12 for that. So As always, you want NVIDIA for VR. Pimax also confirmed this to me when I asked. Compatibility on their implementation is also quite good too, though not perfect. I personally tested 58 VR native games and experiences, with 32 out of 58 working natively with Pimax's software without issues. You can check out the little list right here. There are some pretty big titles, aren't they? But then there's also a quick list of what didn't work. Also some big ones there. Now, unfortunately, Pimax's DFR only works via OpenVR at this time. It does not work at all via OpenXR. So, if something is OpenXR only, like say Phasmophobia, you can't use it there, you're out of luck. But you can still use DFR in some OpenXR titles via the same methods with something like the OpenXR toolkit. Thanks, Mbusha. Considering how the usual Pimax experience is, particularly on the software, it is pleasantly surprising to see how well the eye tracking is working between the accuracy and the compatibility, even if it's not perfect. Though, Toby is also involved on this part, so that could be a reason too. There are other forms of DFR you can use that aren't exclusive to Pimax and lead to some very, very stupid gains. In particular with a program called Quad Views Foveated. Again, this is by Mbusha. He is a great guy. But only 2 games really support it at this time. That being DCS and Pavlov. This is not a feature exclusive to the Crystal though. Any major eye-tracked HMD like the Aero or the Quest Pro can do this. But it is a legitimate selling point for the Crystal over non-eye-tracked headsets if you play those games a lot. And because those games are truly otherworldly. Like, the gains people dreamed about when first talking about DFR. I dialed the Crystal's resolution all the way up to 8,622 by 10,204 per eye in Pavlov. And without quad views, I got around 47 FPS average with AA totally disabled. But with quad views based DFR, 113 FPS on average. My frame times literally went up by over 2.4x. And this is at such a ridiculously high resolution, it'll probably be applicable in that game for like 10 years. I will never not be able to play Pavlov at good FPS no matter what headset I have, as long as I can use this. That's huge. And if more games supported this kind of DFR, anything without eye tracking would be totally DOA for me. It already kind of is, since I do play a lot of Pavlov, and the OpenVR games are quite nice too. DFR is... it's honestly one of the coolest damn things I have seen in VR in a long time, and has made me so excited for the future when this is mainstream and natively supported. But until then, Pimax absolutely deserves some praise for making it work with so many titles, even if it's not universal. And so, also talking about the eye tracking software experience as the perfect note to start discussing Pimax's software in general, because it is required to use this. And the general quality is a little complicated. See, the main pro of this software is that you have a truly crazy amount of things you can adjust. Pimax gives you far more native customization than most vendors ever do. You can even adjust individual color channels, contrast, and software IPD offsets. Though I'd say you should largely leave those untouched on the Crystal, since the colors and IPD are fine out of the box. You can also adjust the local dimming by bringing up a hidden menu, which I don't know why that's hidden, but you do that by pressing Ctrl Q, and the software mostly works pretty well. I like it, but there are still some little quirks, and a very notable bug, which I'm surprised it hasn't been fixed yet. Pimax told me they said they fixed it, but it's still happening on my software, so maybe it's just a me thing, but we'll find out maybe the next release. And what that bug is if you hit apply under the games tab under your device, it generates some really bad color values in the software JSON, even if you have everything set to 0. This causes a noticeable orange tint and red shift to the panels. Thankfully, with some manual editing, you can change even things which aren't in the software by default and also fix this. If you follow the file path on screen now and enable viewing hidden folders in Windows, you can open up profile.json there, and you can do a bunch of things. from fixing the color values by zeroing them out, changing the local dimming to whatever setting and value you want, lots of things. If you don't have the lines in your particular file, just change a setting in the client and it'll generate them, or you can add it manually. You will need to restart the client for these edits to apply, though. But there also is some general software issues on the Crystal besides the color values. The Crystal has a big, well-documented problem with your play space being all wrong and the floor resetting between boots. To fix this, thankfully it's pretty simple, but you're going to need OVR advanced settings and to use space fix function in it, which takes about 10 seconds at best to do, thankfully, but it is a little annoying since, like, I usually need to do it most of the time I start the Crystal. But I'm still not done with some little quirks that you need to keep in mind, because now we do gotta talk about the battery and the USB hub. A lot of people have made a big stink about the battery, but with the USB hub, I don't think this is going to be an issue for most. I tested and got around 5.5 hours on the fiber cable at 120 Hz with 100% brightness. And with Hotswap, that's over 10 hours of battery life since 2 are included, and you should be fine for the vast majority of people. Even 1 battery is likely enough for most sessions. And if you decide to dial down the brightness to about 80%, the battery drain, it goes way down. I got just barely over 10 hours of battery life before I got the 10% battery notification at 80% brightness and 120 Hz mode. But that said, the brightness does take a significant hit doing that. I'd probably go for 90 for a nice middle ground if you wanted to get some extra battery life, though. The copper cable, which has 2 USB ports, should get even more battery life, though. These tests by me were done on the fiber optic cable. I have, though, noticed a number of people having issues with the hub not providing that extra battery. Not sure on what the cause for that is. It's currently under investigation. However, there are a few things with respect to the battery situation, because it can just never be simple with Pimax, can it? Firstly, the hub connector. On the hub side, it's bad. Like, really bad. It is the loosest connection I've seen, to where I had to tape it like this to my legs, my table's leg, or else I would face constant disconnects and unreliability. But after doing this, I've gone weeks without issues, and I've seen this complaint repeated quite often too. But I've known at least one person whose connector was pretty solid, so maybe it's a QC thing. I don't have a huge sample size. Secondly, you cannot grab any random USB hub to replace it, as when I tried using another powered USB hub off of Amazon, which was an expensive one granted, I only got around 3 hours of battery life, and hot swapping did not work. And by hot swapping not working with a third-party hub, I mean the HMD just turned off entirely and I had to reboot SteamVR. How hot swap is supposed to work is that you just push the power button right here to turn off the screen, then you remove the battery from the back, slot the new one in, and then you just push the power button again, and you're good to go. If you truly need more power, though, you can plug in the side USB-C port right here into a charger, which seems to provide near infinite battery life, at least for me while I'm on the hub. This is also the only way that it seems like you can charge the battery while it's inside the HMD, at least. Because it does not seem to charge while the headset is turned off, so if you don't want to use the battery dock, that's your option. That said, officially, Pimax has recommended against leaving it plugged in all the time, so I might not leave this on overnight to charge. However, I have been using this to charge my Crystal since back in April. The only time I have ever changed the battery via hot swap here was for testing purposes. And I haven't seen any ill effects on the battery yet, but take that how you will and use this at your own discretion. It is an option if you truly need that extra battery, though. Now, I normally like to do a quick little comparison to other headsets, but all the headsets I would consider competitors to this are either out now or are coming soonish. Which I would say is the Quest Pro, the Big Screen Beyond, the Vario Aero, and the 8KX. And I have done extensive research on these and do have my own opinion. Most of them don't really interest me. I only have notable personal experience with the 8KX. Plus, this video is already super long, so I'm going to just focus on the 8KX, since I know some people were curious, so I was going to ditch it for the Crystal. And I can very confidently say, yes, absolutely yes. See, if it was just the extra sharpness, if it was just the 120 hertz, if it was just the colors, then perhaps I'd still be on the 8KX. But the 8KX literally has only field of view, which is a big pro, yes, but the Crystal absolutely decimates the previous flagship in every single other area. It's not even close in any of them. The optics are better, the sharpness is a generation ahead, the colors pop, comfort is significantly improved with or without mods, and I am a sucker for frames, and while this supports above 90 while my 8KX is still only at 90. And then there is the eye tracking, which actually provides an otherworldly boost in some situations. I also get to ditch the knuckles because I don't like them. And I know that's going to be an unpopular opinion. I miss the FOV. I really miss the FOV. And if the Crystal actually hit 125 horizontal, I'd probably miss it a bit less. But everything else is just so much better. I do hope the wide FOV lenses will actually hit 115, 120 to hold me off till the 12K. The Crystal, on a hardware level, and since I don't mind tinkering, has been my favorite headset by far, and the best experience I've had out of any I've tried. Nothing else even comes close when it works. But that is because I don't mind something not fully plug and play. But here is the thing. I can't just talk about the hardware aspect, because the Crystal is missing a lot of features that are promised to be on the way. From wireless, standalone, lighthouse faceplate, mixed reality faceplate, wide FOV lenses, all those things. The sheer magnitude of missing stuff Pimax still has yet to release but has talked about just means I can't not comment on it, as I know this is a Crystal review, but I have to talk about the company behavior in relation to how much you should trust in those coming features and when they'll arrive. Because there's just so much to come, and there are issues around the features which are out right now, let alone the ones that aren't out. I can't make a recommendation in good conscience without doing this, because it's just... I'd love to really say, yes, get the Crystal if you're an enthusiast and want a bunch of features if you don't mind the bulk. But because of the behavior and the bad marketing, it's hard for me to recommend the headset so readily. Pimax, over several years of its existence, has had a lot of controversy. And while in some ways they have improved, in a lot of ways they still have massive problems, even as recent as the last 3 months. The Crystal's launch and communication around it was a complete disaster. One of the worst product launches I've seen in recent times. You had multiple reps confused on what people were even supposed to get, with some saying everyone should have gotten glass lenses by default, customers not being informed they were going to get plastic until after they paid in some cases, reps not sure if the fiber optic cable was supposed to be the default cable, or if it was an early pre-order bonus, or if a new cable was supposed to solve the battery issues, and even fighting with some people over it, or if the fiber was just a lucky random chance to get it. Then there's the lying about the field of view, the constant slipping dates and promises, the Crystal being launched in a painfully obvious beta state with subpar tracking 2 months ago, alongside so many missing features. And just numerous cases of reps stating one thing only for contradicting information to come out from another one. And if this was a one-time thing, perhaps people would be more willing to go easy on Pimax, as they have responded to and addressed some of these issues recently. But the thing is, it feels like this is how the conversation has been around Pimax for years. And I really wanted to believe Pimax could change, as for a while, prior to the launch, it seemed like they were doing everything better aside from being late. And I can't even be too harsh on that, since it feels like almost everyone's late with smaller hardware companies, and especially VR. As long as you nail the release, that's what's important. But then the launch happened, and I don't know. I don't know if the company will ever change. The eternal cycle is a mistake happens, apology comes out, but then the same stupid choices happen, and it feels like nothing was learned. time is a flat circle with Pimax. And yeah, other companies have had their own screw-ups or things to critique, even in the VR sphere. Definitely more than a few examples I could bring up there. And I believe everyone deserves a chance to correct their mistakes. But it just feels like Pimax is almost in a perpetual state of 2 steps forward, a step and a half back. Pimax's communication has been criticized many times, and yet still is terrible. And I really do feel for some of the reps with how it must feel so frustrating with how they look to the community when given inaccurate or outdated information, because what are they supposed to say? I've personally talked with several employees at Pimax who are good and nice people, but it just seems like there is some major issues at the top level somewhere in the company. And sometimes I don't even know if I should trust what I hear without multiple people confirming it or a third party has it in hand. And having that level of faith in a company's statements is a very bad thing. And this relates to the future features because Pimax's schedule has slipped many times. The features coming out in a rough state or just aren't up for prime time till later, or they'll just even flat out change what was promised. Like the lens thing. Well, turns out that second pair of 42 ppd lenses they boasted about day one, it's plastic! When they made such a gigantic deal about their glass lenses at every step of the way in numerous pages or ads. And I truly mean numerous. And it's also only for a limited time run. But that's not all! If you want the wide FOV as your second pair instead, you gotta pay for it because glass is expensive. Yes, I think most people will prefer the wide FOV if it's as good as they claim. But that doesn't change the principle of the matter. Especially because they're giving the 2 lens offer only to paid in full orders before July 31st, and still making you pay for that wide FOV. However, if you order after that, well, too goddamn bad. You don't get a second pair of lenses like they constantly advertise and boasted about. Pay up if you want it. Watching this, I feel like Lando working with Darth Vader.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further. Perhaps you think you're being treated unfairly? No.
To Pimax's credit, they usually do deliver in the end, and I think we will eventually get most of those promised features, which is a lot more than can be said for some companies. It's just the delivery is usually very late and often filled with an incredibly bumpy road and a couple of asterisks. The Crystal might have all these missing features fixed by next year, and in fact I bet on it being pretty great come next year. But that's not the Crystal we have today, and may not have for a while. Pimax, I really hope you can address some of your issues, because I love the hardware, and the general design philosophy aligns with my tastes, and really pushing things to the limit. I don't care about size, I like features, and you make my favorite headsets by far. But it feels hard to support the company with the decisions made despite that, and to wreck them with how much research you have to do to not feel like you're getting taken for a ride. And sometimes I still do. This comes from a place of wanting to see you do better, because you make some really awesome hardware I adore, even if it comes with some jank when pushing boundaries as far as you can. I would love to be able to recommend your stuff with all the asterisks. This all said though, if you have heard everything I've had to say, done your research, and you still want to buy the Crystal, then alright, as long as you're making an informed decision, and that's yours to make. But I'd still might wait a little bit for now. I have liked mine on a hardware level, and most of my issues are with the company's behavior than the hardware. Not everyone's going to feel the same as me. But if you are somebody who likes to gamble and are determined to buy into the public beta testing here, even after all these warnings, I'll have a link in the description, but I still would strongly urge you to wait till it's on something like Amazon, somewhere with a very good return policy and a little more responsive support, since I've heard some issues concerning support lately, if you truly do want to buy it. It's already made its way to some third parties, like Newegg, rather. But I also want to note that while I can't say exactly discount the coming features entirely, as I said, I do think Pimax will eventually deliver, I would not put too much weight into them panning out exactly like Pimax's promise or coming exactly when stated, given everything that's happened. If those features matter to you or are a major selling point, just wait until they're actually out before buying. It may be a while till we see some of them, or Pimax may arbitrarily change their minds on something later. If you buy the crystal now, buy it because you're at least mostly content with how it is at this moment. Treat the missing features as a bit of a nice bonus when or if they come, rather than a serious purchasing factor. Except perhaps the lighthouse faceplate and the eye tracking, because that has been demoed in public working fine, and we even have videos promoting it, so likely isn't too far away, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's still at least like another month or so. And yeah, that's essentially the crystal. If I had to summarize real quickly and skip over so much stuff, I'm not even going to try and do a good summary of this hour-long video at this rate. I think the crystal is an incredible piece of hardware that's got some great features. Even if Pimax did flat out lie on things like adding 20 degrees of FOV to what you really get, so then the FOV seems like a disappointment purely by comparison. The brightness is beyond most headsets, the colors are a match for the best in the industry, and the contrast ratio in blacks do feel OLED-like at their best, even if they still do suffer a bit from blooming in certain scenes. It is even well balanced despite the weight, but you're going to have to work around a few kinks to get the best experience, and the company behind it is kind of a chaotic mess and sometimes hard to trust. I'm still greatly enjoying my crystal, and it's going to be my daily driver until the 12K comes out, as nobody else is even making wide FOV, not even slightly wide FOV. I also profoundly disagree with the notion that this is a Simmers-only headset. I don't even play Sims. I still love this. And if you don't compare it to some of the marketing, or you can look past the company's shenanigans, if you are willing to dial it in, I think enthusiasts might find some real enjoyment out of this. But don't buy it with the promised features having too much weight to them, and just wait till those features are actually out if they are a major deal for you. There is still a lot of potential in the crystal, but it's not yet realized, and it's definitely hampered by everything surrounding it. Alright. That was my longest review ever. If you have watched the whole thing, genuinely, thank you. I never thought I would make something this long, or that people would even want to watch something so in-depth. I hope the information I provided felt meaningful and not too long-winded. This went through a lot of revisions and editing, trying to cover as much information, community fixes, and the general important talking points I could, while still trying to be as reasonably paced as I could with everything I was covering. Thank you so much for watching again. If you decide to stick around, I'll see you in the next video, which will probably maybe be like a gameplay one, or I might or that dynamic Foveated rendering video. If you don't stick around, then, well, thanks for stopping by either way, and thanks for watching the hour-long video. Thanks, and later. Bye.